Teaching Christian Basics, Lesson 27. Boom! Oh, Christology. Boom! We're on to it now, the real stuff. We're on to the doctrine that makes Christianity Christianity. It's the stuff about Jesus. We talked about the first great mystery of the Christian faith a couple videos ago when we talked about the doctrine of the Holy Blessed Trinity. The three persons in the unity of the singular divine essence and so forth. Now we talk about Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, and we want to talk about the person of Jesus, and we want to talk about the work of Jesus. There's so much to talk about here. We're just kind of skimming the surface. So let's do this. This is going to be Christology Part 0, in some ways kind of pre-Christology, and we want to talk about the promises of the Messiah. Let's do this. In fact, let's talk about, got it. Let's talk about Jesus in the Old Testament. It's one of the errors that people have when they look at the Bible and they think Old Testament, God the Father, New Testament, Jesus, now Holy Spirit. Now that's kind of a modalism, or it's a bad way to think about it, because we see that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were there at the very beginning. I think we mentioned this before. There's this great line when Luther wants to talk about the doctrine of the Trinity. What's your proof text? And he says Genesis 1 and 2. Blam! Right there is God, the Spirit, and the Word, the three in one. So that the second person of the Holy Trinity is co-eternal with the Father and the Spirit. Jesus is begotten of the Father before all worlds. And this is this eternal day that Psalm 2 talks about so beautifully. Today, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me and I will give it to you. Which is an amazing thing, that the eternal begottenness of the Father is bound up to this conversation of the Son and the Father, so that the Son is asking and the Father is giving. It's amazing to consider. So that Jesus is there throughout the Old Testament. And we can recognize Jesus in three ways in the Old Testament. Now, the chief way that people normally talk about this, where do you find Christ in the Old Testament, is by the Messianic Prophecies, which are wonderful and multitudinous. Just to kind of run through a couple of them, we have the great chief promise of Genesis 3:15, when the Lord promises to the devil, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. That's a child of a woman without the help of a man, who will have the strength to destroy the devil himself. In other words, he'll be a divine son. And from that promise expands all the other promises. So we have God promising to Abraham, in your seed the nations will be blessed. Isaac, your seed, Jacob, and then Judah, the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 sons of Jacob are the 12 tribes of Israel. And to Judah, the Lord promises, the scepter will not depart from Judah until the Messiah, the King, has come. That's Genesis chapter 50. And so those are some of the promises. And then this promise of Jesus, the promise of the Messiah, extends through all the preaching of the prophets. I was looking at this beautiful thing. We put it on the blog, so you can search wolfmueller.co, that Alfred Edersheim references 456 passages of the Old Testament that the rabbis, before the time of Jesus, considered to be referencing the Messiah. That's an amazing sort of thing. And just to hit a couple of key ones, we have in Deuteronomy, for example, we have the promise that God gives, I will raise up a prophet like you from among your brothers, you shall listen to him. We have the promise that the Lord would be born in Bethlehem, given to Micah, that he would be born of a virgin, Isaiah chapter 7, that he will be that a light will shine, and he will be King of Kings, a wonderful counselor. Isaiah preaches these sorts of things. We have the promise that he'll ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. That's the promise of Zechariah. And Zechariah also promises they will look on him whom they pierced. Isaiah has these beautiful promises of the crucifixion, the substitutionary atonement, and the death of Jesus. By his stripes we are healed, and we all like sheep have gone astray, and so forth, in Isaiah 53. In fact, probably the clearest descriptions of the crucifixion of Jesus are not in the New Testament Gospels, but rather in the Old Testament. Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? And the whole psalm describes the crucifixion of Jesus. It's really quite incredible. We have the prophecy of the ascension of Jesus in Psalm 68, the humiliation of Jesus in Psalm 8, and any number of other passages scattered throughout the Old Testament. One of the chief promises comes in 2 Samuel chapter 7. David was going to build a temple. The Lord was still in the tabernacle, the tent, and he wanted to build him a permanent house there in Jerusalem. And Nathan the prophet says, go ahead and do it. But then Nathan has a dream, and so they go and they turn around and, sorry, let me pause. Sorry, hazardous driving conditions. A Jaguar crashed into a Mercedes. That is a bad day for the insurance company. Anyway, oh yeah, David wants to build a temple, and Nathan says, no, the Lord will build you a house, and your seed will sit on the throne forever. So we have this extended promise of the seed now to David. That's when Jesus asked the Pharisees, whose son is the Messiah? They say the son of David, because of that promise. David sees the Lord having a conversation. Psalm 110, the Lord said to my Lord, sit here at your right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Psalm 110. Anyway, that's just like a handful. That's a smattering of the dozens and dozens of the hundreds of promises of Jesus in the Old Testament. Really incredible. And Jesus fulfills them all. The T, he's betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. He's betrayed by a kiss by his friend. He's stricken and yet he's risen. He's afflicted, he's dead, and he's living forever. After 3 days, the Lord revives his people through the resurrection of Jesus. He's pierced, he's whipped, he's despised. All of this is promised in the Old Testament. So that's the first way that Jesus is in the Old Testament. The second way that Jesus is in the Old Testament is often discussed under the category of typology. Tupos is the Greek word for this, and it's the word for a stamp. It's like a wax seal, and so you see a reflection. You see like the shape of the stamp is pushed into the wax, and so we kind of have a pattern or a shape of the way God does things pressed in to the unfolding story of the Old Testament. So the types would be especially having to do with worship and especially having to do with the sacrifice. When the Lord institutes the tabernacle and the sacrifices from the very beginning in the garden, and then especially on Mount Sinai with the Old Testament people, he's giving them a picture of the crucifixion of Jesus. It's an unfolding of the heavenly council. So there's a throne room in heaven, and God sits on the throne, and Jesus presents his blood there for our forgiveness and for our righteousness and so forth. And that's reflected in this typological way in the Old Testament. Moses leads the people out of bondage into the promised land, and so Jesus leads us out of darkness to life. So he becomes a type of Christ and so forth. So we see in the pattern of the way God works in the Old Testament, and in the specifics of the way God works, we see a preaching of Christ. I don't want to go too crazy with the types. We want to make sure that the types are established themselves, that we know that that's what the Lord is doing. So, the New Testament will tell us stuff like the ark is a type of baptism, and so we can see that thing. But if we just start making these things up on our own, we leave the solid ground, I think. And so we want to be a little bit cautious. But we see the way that the Lord works is consistent. Now, the third way that Jesus is in the Old Testament is that he's in the Old Testament. In fact, we can say with this great confidence that most of the time that God shows up in the Old Testament, it's the second person of the Trinity. It's the Son of God. Jesus says in John chapter 1 that no one at any time has seen God, but the only begotten God who's in the bosom of the Father has made him known. So that when God is talking, that's the Word, Jesus. When God is walking, that's Jesus who's walking. Sometimes it's called a Theophany or a Christophany, an appearance of God, that he shows up. And I think that, so for example, whenever we see the Lord walking in the garden, or the Lord standing before Moses, or when you hear in the prophets, the word of the Lord came to Amos or Obadiah or something like that, we ought to just see the picture in our mind of Jesus standing before Obadiah and saying, preach this. He's there. It's not like Jesus came to be. in the New Testament. He was always working all through the Old Testament. It is his kingdom that's being established in the world. So that's Christology part 0, pre-Christology, or the promise of Jesus in the Old Testament. And this is Teaching Christian Basics, lesson 20. I can't remember. 20 something.